The gravel crunched under the tires of the department SUV, a sound that, after 3 hours of winding mountain roads, had become less an annoyance and more a hypnotic rhythm. I'd seen enough remote sights in my career to know that remote usually meant a place no one in their right mind would ever willingly visit, and this patch of forested wilderness was certainly living up to the billing. The late afternoon sun, already dipping behind the jagged peaks, cast long, distorted shadows that danced like restless spirits among the pines. My name is William, and I've spent the better part of 2 decades sifting through the remains of lives cut short, or more often, lives simply forgotten. The romance of the bone whisperer, as some junior officers used to jokingly call me, had long since faded, replaced by a quiet, often grim, pragmatism. These days, I mostly just felt the ache in my knees and the weariness in my soul. Still, when the call came, a skeleton in the woods, I packed my kit. It's what I do. The vehicle finally shuddered to a halt beside a makeshift perimeter marked by bright yellow tape strung between trees. A handful of uniformed officers milled about, their breath misting in the crisp autumn air. The air itself smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and something else. Something metallic, faint, almost imperceptible that my nose, honed over years, still registered. William, the lead detective, greeted me, his face a map of exhaustion and irritation. He was a good man, steady, but he preferred cases with witnesses and clear motives, not the silent, cryptic puzzles I usually dealt with. Glad you made it. We've got bones. So I heard, I replied, grabbing my field bag from the back. What's the initial assessment? He sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. Looks like natural causes, exposure. Hiker stumbled on it a couple of days ago. Animal scattering, the usual. We've secured the scene as best we can, but it's been out here a while. I nodded, already scanning the scene through the gaps in the trees. My eyes were drawn to a slight depression in the ground just beyond the tape where the forest floor looked disturbed. Not necessarily suspicious, just different. Show me. He led me through a narrow path, the ground soft with decades of fallen leaves, and then I saw it. Nestled amongst a cluster of moss-covered rocks and ferns, partially obscured by a fallen birch log, was what remained of a human being. The skeleton was mostly articulated, lying supine, as if simply having laid down for a final rest. The bones were a mottled gray-brown, weathered by sun and rain, with patches of green algae clinging to some surfaces. A few smaller bones, phalanges, were scattered a foot or two away, likely moved by small scavengers. My gut reaction, the one that often spoke before my brain fully engaged, was a quiet agreement with the detective. This looked like a textbook case of exposure. Someone wandered off the path, got lost, succumbed to the elements. A sad, common story in these parts. I knelt, pulling on my examination gloves, the latex snapping crisply in the quiet. "We haven't touched anything, William," the detective said, standing a respectful distance away. "Just photographed the general area." "Good," I murmured, my gaze fixed on the skull. It lay facing skyward, the empty orbit staring blankly at the fading light. No obvious trauma. The mandible was detached, resting beside the cranium. The teeth, though stained, appeared mostly intact. I began my methodical survey, starting with the environment immediately surrounding the remains. The ground beneath the skeleton was a mix of compacted soil and leaf litter. I noted the types of vegetation: ferns, moss, a few struggling saplings. Some of the roots had grown around the bones, not through them, suggesting the body had been there before the significant root growth, or that the roots were simply shallow. A small colony of ants marched purposefully near the pelvis. Then I saw it, a glint, barely visible, tucked beneath the left humerus, which lay slightly disarticulated from the shoulder joint. It was a fragment of something plastic, about the size of my thumbnail, a dull, almost opaque white. It looked completely out of place in the organic decay of the forest floor. I didn't touch it, just observed. My gaze moved back to the skull. The detective was right, no obvious trauma. But as I leaned closer, carefully brushing away a few stubborn pine needles, I noticed something subtle. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on the right temporal bone just above the ear. It wasn't a fracture, not an impact mark. It was more like a subtle leaching, a slight etching into the surface, almost as if a corrosive liquid had dripped there, but only a tiny amount and long ago. It was the kind of detail most people would miss or dismiss as natural degradation. My initial assessment, that quiet agreement with the detective, was now being challenged. The plastic shard, the etching on the skull. The forest was an efficient recycler, but it rarely left behind plastic calling cards, and even less often did it leave such precise, localized marks on bone. I spent another hour at the scene, meticulously documenting every bone, every fragment of clothing, every insect casing, every detail of the surrounding flora. I took photographs from every angle, measured distances, sketched the layout. The sun had completely vanished, plunging the forest into a deep twilight before I was ready to call it. "We need to move the remains," I announced, standing up slowly, my knees protesting. "Carefully. Every bone, every fragment, but I know what it isn't. It isn't as simple as someone just lying down and dying." The mobile forensic unit at a remote location was a large, nondescript white trailer, a beacon of clinical sterility parked jarringly amongst the rugged pines a mile down the access road. Inside, it was a different world. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating stainless steel tables, an array of specialized tools, and a powerful ventilation system that scrubbed the air clean. With the help of a uniformed officer, I carefully transferred the remains onto one of the examination tables. Each bone was gently placed on a white sheet, preserving its relative position as much as possible. The air was cool and still. The only sounds were the whirring of the equipment and the rustle of my own movements. I started again, but this time under the harsh, unforgiving light of the unit with the luxury of time and precision tools. I used a magnifying lamp, a soft brush, a pair of fine forceps. The plastic fragment, once cleaned, revealed itself to be a tiny piece of a common synthetic polymer, a type used in countless household items. Nothing distinct, but still an anomaly in the wild. Then, the skull. I held it gently, turning it under the lamp. The discoloration on the temporal bone was clearer now, a shallow, almost polished depression. It wasn't an animal gnaw mark, nor was it consistent with insect activity or general weathering. It was too precise, too localized. It looked almost deliberate, as if something small, hard, and hot had been briefly pressed against it, or a concentrated chemical agent applied with surgical precision. I ran my gloved finger over the mark, a shiver tracing its way down my spine. It was a subtle detail, yes, but it spoke volumes to my trained eye. A natural death in the wilderness didn't leave behind traces like this. Animals didn't do it. Weather didn't do it. No, this wasn't an accident. This was something else entirely. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it look like an accident. And that, I knew, was always far more dangerous than a simple, tragic mishap. The silent puzzle had just started speaking, and it was telling me a story of deceit. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the mobile forensic unit at a remote location was a constant, almost soothing drone, but it did little to calm the prickle of anticipation in my gut. I'd spent enough years in this line of work to know that remote wilderness sight rarely meant simple natural death. It usually meant a lot of dirt, a lot of patience, and a lot of questions that wouldn't answer themselves. My equipment cases, packed with trowels, brushes, sieves, and measuring tapes, were already in the back of the utility vehicle. The air inside the mobile unit, recycled and filtered, smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. A colleague, a younger woman with an impressive array of field certifications, was meticulously arranging her photographic gear on a stainless steel counter. He glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Ready, William. The lead detective is waiting by the access trail." "As I'll ever be," I replied, adjusting the straps of my field vest. My internal clock was already ticking, counting down the hours of daylight we had left. The pines outside cast long shadows, even in the late morning sun, hinting at the encroaching chill of the wilderness. The drive to the actual discovery site was short, bumpy, and jarring. We followed a narrow, rutted track that barely qualified as a road, winding deeper into a dense stand of ponderosa pines. The forest floor was a thick carpet of needles, fallen branches, and the occasional granite outcropping. The air grew sharper, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Every bump of the tires sent a jolt up my spine, a physical reminder of the isolation we were driving into. When the driver finally braked, the silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the treetops. The lead detective, a man whose weary eyes spoke volumes about the cases he'd seen, was waiting by a section of yellow tape strung haphazardly between two trees. He wore a heavy plaid jacket, his breath pluming in the crisp air. "William," he greeted, his voice low. "Thanks for getting out here so fast." "Standard procedure," I said, stepping out of the vehicle, my boots crunching on the pine needles. The ground sloped gently down into a small, shallow depression. This was it. The scene itself was unassuming, almost peaceful. A scattering of bones, bleached and pale, lay nestled amongst a bed of fallen leaves and pine needles. The skeletal remains were mostly articulated, the long bones of the legs extending from a pelvis, ribs arcing around a collapsed chest cavity, and a skull resting a few feet away, partially obscured by a patch of moss. It looked, at first glance, exactly what it was meant to look like, the remnants of a life quietly returned to the earth. "Hiker found them yesterday morning off the main trail," the detective explained, gesturing vaguely with a gloved hand. "Thought it was a deer at first, then he got closer." I nodded, my eyes already scanning, absorbing the panorama. The trees here were old, thick-trunked, their branches heavy with snow in winter, undoubtedly providing a dense canopy. The ground was uneven, a mix of decomposing plant matter and loamy soil. No obvious signs of a struggle, no disturbed earth in a wide radius. Just bones, leaves, and the quiet grandeur of the forest. My colleague began setting up her tripod, the whir of her camera lends a brief intrusion. I pulled on my own pair of nitrile gloves, the thin material a second skin. "What's the initial assessment?" I asked, though I already had my own forming. "Looks like natural causes, maybe a heart attack while hiking," the detective offered, shrugging. No signs of trauma the patrol officers could see. No clothes either, just the bones. "No clothes," I repeated, a small internal flag fluttering. It wasn't unheard of for scavengers to carry off fabric or for it to degrade entirely, but the complete absence always warranted a second thought. "Any personal effects?" The detective shook his head. "Nothing, not a trace, just the bones." I approached the yellow tape, stopping just short of the perimeter. My gaze swept over the scene again, slower this time, my mind already cataloging. The light was good, filtering through the pines, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I unzipped a pocket on my vest, pulling out my small field notebook and a pencil. "I'll need to establish a grid," I informed them. "No one steps in until it's mapped." The detective nodded. "Understood, we've kept everyone back." I spent the next hour meticulously setting up the grid, running measuring tapes from a central datum point, marking quadrants with small flags. It was tedious work but essential. Every piece of information, every bone fragment, every insect casing, needed its precise location recorded. The sun climbed higher, casting the scene in a harsher, more revealing light. Finally, with the grid in place and my colleague taking her initial overhead shots, I knelt at the edge of the first quadrant. The air was cool against my face. I picked up a small, soft-bristled brush, the kind used for archaeological digs, and began to carefully sweep away the loose pine needles and leaf litter from around the skull. The skull was mostly intact, though weathered. No obvious blunt force trauma, no bullet entry or exit wounds. The eye orbits were empty, staring up at the canopy. As I worked my way around the cranium, gently clearing debris, I noticed something. Or rather, I noticed the absence of something. There was very little root growth through the bones. In a forest setting, especially after a significant period of time, it was common to find fine feeder roots, sometimes even larger ones, growing through the natural openings in a skeleton, the vertebral column, the pelvic cavity, even the foramina of the skull. These roots, seeking nutrients, would often tightly bind the remains to the earth. Here, while there were some roots around the bones, hardly any had penetrated them. It was as if the bones had been laid on the surface, rather than having decomposed into it over a long, undisturbed period. I paused, my brush hovering. My internal monologue, usually a calm stream of observation, stuttered. That's odd. Then I noticed another detail. Beneath a section of the femur, where it rested on a mat of older, more decomposed leaves, the newer, reddish-brown pine needles were remarkably clean, almost pristine. They didn't show the typical compression or degradation one would expect from a heavy bone resting on them for years. It was as if they had only recently fallen, after the bone had been placed there. My jaw tightened. My initial assessment, the one that screamed natural causes, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't just a body that had decomposed in place. This looked manipulated. I leaned closer, my gaze tracing the outline of the femur. The ground directly beneath it, once the superficial layer of needles was brushed away, didn't show the faint, shallow depression that years of settling and decay would create. It was almost too flat, too smooth. A flicker of doubt about my own perception crossed my mind. Am I seeing things? The lack of root intrusion, the fresh needles under the bone, the absence of a discernible impression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. This wasn't just a dead body in the woods. This was a staged scene, and that changed everything. The tension in the air, previously a general wilderness quiet, now felt sharpened, focused, almost predatory. The story these bones were telling wasn't about a peaceful end. It was about a deliberate deception. The pristine pine needles, a bright, almost fiery red-brown against the muted forest floor, were a stark anomaly. They hadn't seen the pressure of a heavy bone resting on them, hadn't been ground into the soil by the slow, inexorable march of decomposition. That meant one thing: this particular femur, or at least that section of it, hadn't been where I found it for as long as the rest of the skeleton. My gut tightened. This wasn't a natural settling. This was a disturbance. Careful with this section, I'd instructed the technician, pointing to the delicate leaf litter around the femur. I want it bagged separately, just as it is. The sun was already dipping below the canopy, painting the upper branches in hues of orange and purple by the time we finished the meticulous excavation. Every bone, every fragment of clothing, every insect casing, every sample of soil and plant matter was carefully documented, photographed, and bagged. The air was growing chill, the quiet of the wilderness deepening into something almost oppressive. My mind, however, was buzzing, already dissecting the implications of those untouched needles. We transported the remains back to the mobile forensic unit at a remote location, a surprisingly well-equipped facility on wheels that hummed with its own generator. Inside, the sterile white surfaces and crisp fluorescent lights felt like a different universe from the damp, shadowed forest. The scent of disinfectant replaced the earthy aroma of pine and decay. I peeled off my gloves, my hands aching slightly from the careful work, stretched my back. "Let's get everything laid out on the main table," I told the technician, gesturing to the large, stainless steel surface that dominated the central space. "Start with the general layout as per the site diagram." The process was methodical, almost ritualistic. Bone by bone, the skeleton began to reassemble itself, not as a living being, but as a silent testament to a life ended. The skull came first, then the vertebrae, ribs, pelvis, and finally the long bones of the limbs. I moved around the table, a magnifying visor perched on my forehead, my gaze sweeping over the collection, searching for the stories etched into the calcium and collagen. The initial assessment confirmed what I'd suspected in the field. Adult male, likely mid-40s to early 50s. The robust muscle attachments on the humeri and femurs suggested a man accustomed to physical labor or a very active lifestyle. His teeth, though stained, showed moderate wear, consistent with his estimated age, but one molar in the upper left jaw had a distinctive gold crown, a detail that immediately jumped out as a potential identifier. That was a start. I picked up the femur that had first tipped me off. Under the unit's powerful lights, the underside, where the pristine pine needles had been found, looked no different from the rest of the bone. The clues weren't on the bone, but in its context. "Bring me the bag with the leaf litter from under the femur," I instructed. The technician retrieved a clear plastic bag, carefully labeled. I opened it, spreading the contents onto a clean tray. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of pine. "Notice anything?" I asked the technician, pointing to a small cluster of the fresh needles. The technician leaned in, eyes narrowing. "There, too clean, almost like they just fell, no compression." "Exactly," I said, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. "Now look at the soil sample from the same area beneath that layer." We examined the soil. Interspersed with it were tiny, almost microscopic flecks of a lighter, sandier loam not entirely foreign to the general area, distinctly different from the predominant soil composition directly surrounding the other bones. "This sandy loam," I mused aloud, prodding it with a fine-tipped probe, "it's not uniform, it suggests a disturbance. As if something was placed on the forest floor, then removed and the body settled after that initial disruption, or was placed on top of a disturbed area." My mind raced. If something was placed there, then removed, it would leave a clean space for new needles to fall. Or if the body was placed, then later adjusted, perhaps a limb moved, that would also explain it. The pristine needles weren't just an oddity, they were a deliberate signature of intervention. Then, as I carefully cleaned the left tibia, a small, almost imperceptible line caught my eye. It was a faint ridge, barely thicker than a pencil lead, running diagonally across the shaft, about a third of the way down from the knee joint. I brought the bone closer to my visor, adjusting the magnification. "Take a look at this," I answered, motioning for the technician. "See the periosteal reaction." The technician nodded, pointing to the subtle thickening of the bone around the ridge. "Healed fracture, old though, well remodeled." "Very old," I confirmed, tracing the line with a gloved finger. "Years, perhaps even decades, and it wasn't a clean break. Look at the slight angulation, the way the bone tried to correct itself during healing. It would have been painful and probably left him with a slight limp, or at least a stiffness in that leg." This was a significant find. A specific, well-healed injury could be a key to identity, a distinctive mark that might be on a medical record or known to family. It spoke of a past event, a life lived before he met his end in this remote patch of wilderness. But the more I looked, the more the pieces didn't quite fit together seamlessly. The pristine needles spoke of manipulation at the scene. The old fracture spoke of a life long past. This wasn't just a body found. It was a story told by someone else, using the landscape as their stage. And I was beginning to suspect that story was a lie. The tension in the small unit was palpable, a silent hum of questions waiting for answers. The hum of the generator was a constant, low thrum against the thin metal walls of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. Outside, the wilderness stretched, indifferent and silent. Inside, it was just me, the skeleton, and a flickering LED lamp casting stark shadows across my workbench. The air, despite the small ventilation system, carried a faint, coppery scent of the bone itself, mixed with the sterile tang of disinfectant. I leaned closer, my magnifiers perched on my nose, bringing the delicate structure of the clavicle into sharp relief. The previous chapter ended with me staring at a well-healed injury, a fracture that had knitted together decades ago. It wasn't just any fracture. It had been a clean break, a high-impact trauma, perhaps from a fall or a blunt force strike, but it had mended beautifully, a testament to the body's resilience or, more likely, careful medical intervention. I traced the line of the old break with a gloved fingertip, feeling the subtle ridge where the bone had reformed. The challenge wasn't just seeing the injury, it was interpreting it. A forensic anthropologist's work is like reading a forgotten language etched onto the very architecture of a life. This particular injury, high on the right clavicle, near the sternal notch, was distinctive. Not common, not entirely unique, but specific enough that if it had been documented, it could be a fingerprint of a past trauma. I photographed it from multiple angles, adjusting the light to highlight every subtle contour. Then I moved to the cranium, checking for any signs of perimortem trauma that might have been missed in the initial field assessment. Nothing obvious. The skull was intact, save for the usual post-mortem damage from animal activity, which I had already documented. My gaze drifted to the maxilla. The teeth. They were often the best storytellers. I meticulously cleaned away the last vestiges of soil from the remaining molars and incisors. Most were present, showing moderate wear consistent with the estimated age of the individual late 30s to early 50s. But then I saw it. A missing upper right lateral incisor, not lost post-mortem but extracted cleanly years ago. The bone had completely remodeled, leaving a smooth, empty socket. And next to it, the canine had shifted slightly, drifting into the vacant space. A dental anomaly combined with the distinctive clavicle fracture. Now that was a combination. I took detailed notes, sketching the dental arch, marking the missing tooth and the shifted canine. This was the kind of detail that could narrow down a search significantly. I cross-referenced the estimated age range: sex male, confirmed by pelvic morphology; stature, estimated at 5'10" based on long bone measurements, and these two significant identifiers. The mobile forensic unit at a remote location might have been isolated, but it was equipped. I powered up the internal network, a satellite connection that, while slow, was reliable. I began to input the data into a specialized forensic database, starting with the skeletal sex, age, and estimated stature. Then, the specific details. The healed right clavicle fracture, noting its location and estimated age, at least 2 decades old, judging by the complete remodeling and lack of osteophytic changes. Finally, the missing upper right lateral incisor and the shifted canine. The search churned, the progress bar inching forward at a glacial pace. My internal clock ticked with it. I paced the cramped space, running a hand over my stubbled jaw. My mind raced, piecing together fragments. If this person had such a distinctive injury and dental work, they must have had some medical or dental history. Someone must have known about it. After what felt like an eternity, the database returned a handful of potential matches. Most were quickly dismissed. Wrong sex, wrong age range, no matching dental work. But one entry made me freeze. It wasn't a perfect match, not yet, but the similarities were striking. The database entry was for a missing person, a male, reported missing nearly 25 years ago from a town not 300 miles from here. His estimated age at disappearance would place him squarely in my current victim's age range. Stature was within an inch. Then came the medical history. A severe right clavicle fracture sustained in a logging accident when he was a teenager, requiring extensive rehabilitation, and a dental record noting the extraction of an upper right lateral incisor due to trauma from the same incident. My breath hitched. The air in the unit suddenly felt thick-heavy. This wasn't just a match, this was an echo, a ghost from the past whispering from the sterile confines of my workbench. The name of the missing person was William, my namesake. I pulled up the full missing person report. No body ever found. No suspects. Just a man who vanished without a trace into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Until now. This changed everything. My initial assessment that this was a recent murder staged to look like a natural death now had another layer. If this was indeed the missing William, then his death occurred decades ago, yet his body had only recently been found, seemingly placed here, carefully positioned. Why? Who would hold onto a body for 25 years only to discover it now? Or, more disturbingly, was the staging recent, meaning the original burial site was disturbed and the skeleton moved? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit. If he died 25 years ago, the soft tissue decomposition would have been complete long ago. Yet the way the body was found, the subtle details of its placement, it suggested a more recent manipulation, a recent discovery of an old death. Wait, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding rough in the quiet. That doesn't add up. If the body had been lying there for decades, exposed to the elements, the bones would have been scattered, weathered, stained differently. The environment at the site didn't suggest a quarter century of exposure. The soil, the insect activity, the plant growth, it all pointed to a more recent deposition. Could I be wrong? Was this merely a coincidence of two individuals having similar, yet not identical, injuries? My training screamed at me, doubt everything until proven. I re-examined the clavicle, then the dental records from the missing person file. The descriptions were precise. The fracture pattern, the exact tooth. It was too specific to be a mere coincidence. The probability was astronomically low. No, this was him. This was the missing William. The killer, if there was one, had been free for 25 years. And now someone had brought his victim back into the light. To implicate someone, to tie up a loose end, or to send a message. The mobile forensic unit, which had felt like a secure, if cramped, bubble, now felt exposed. Out here, in this remote location, I was alone with a 25-year-old mystery. And whoever had orchestrated this macabre reveal was still out there, possibly watching. The tension in the air was palpable, thick, and suffocating. I had just opened a door to a very old, very dark room, and I had a feeling the occupant of that room wasn't happy about it. The air, recycled and filtered, still held a faint, earthy tang, a ghost of the wild world I'd temporarily sealed myself off from. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the clear shield of my magnifying visor. The initial, hurried assessment at the discovery site had painted a picture of a natural death, perhaps a hiker lost to the elements, their bones picked clean by scavengers and bleached by sun. But the more time I spent with these remains, the more that neat picture blurred, then began to fray at the edges. My gloved fingers traced the curve of a rib, then moved to the pelvis, where a small, dark clump of material still clung tenaciously. It wasn't bone, not rock. It looked like compacted earth, but something about its texture, even under the lens, felt wrong. Too fine, too uniform for the coarse, sandy loam I'd collected from around the immediate discovery site. I carefully scraped a minuscule sample into a sterile dish, then turned to the microscope. The unit wasn't a fully fledged laboratory, but it was equipped with the essentials, enough to confirm or deny my creeping suspicions. I adjusted the focus, the tiny particles shimmering into sharp relief. At first glance, it was just dirt. Bits of quartz, feldspar, organic detritus. But as I systematically scanned the field, my brow furrowed. There were fragments of something else, something fibrous and distinct. Not animal hair, not typical rootlets. They were almost glassy, with a crystalline structure I didn't recognize from the local flora, and the soil itself. My initial assumption, the one I'd scribbled down in my field notes, was that the individual had simply succumbed where they fell. The environment had then done its work, reducing flesh to bone. But this small, stubborn clump told a different story. This wasn't just a matter of re-evaluating the time since death. It was a fundamental challenge to the death location. If the body had been moved, then this wasn't an unfortunate accident. This was deliberate. This was a crime. I pushed back from the microscope, peeling off my gloves. My eyes drifted back to the skeleton, now seen through a new, more cynical lens. Every bone, every crevice, every tiny bit of adhering material suddenly screamed for re-examination. The overall decomposition suggested a specific time frame, perhaps a year or two, given the conditions. But if the body had been somewhere else first, a place with different soil, different microbial activity, different exposure to elements, then that time frame could be skewed dramatically. Accelerated in a damp, rich environment, retarded in a dry, sealed one. I retrieved the soil samples from the discovery site, lining them up next to the microscopic slide. The contrast was undeniable. The discovery site soil was pale, gritty, studded with tiny pine needles and fragments of decaying bark. The soil from the skeleton, however, was a deep, almost black loam. It was the kind of earth found in old-growth forests or perhaps disturbingly cultivated land, not the wild, unkempt scrub of this remote location. "Well, William," I murmured to the silent skeleton, my voice raspy in the contained space, "someone didn't want you found where you died." This wasn't a simple case of exposure. This was planning. This was effort. To move a body, especially one already in an advanced state of decomposition, was no small feat. It required intent, a means of transport, and a desire to conceal. The natural death hypothesis, already wobbly, now collapsed entirely. I spent the next hour meticulously brushing every remaining fleck of adhering material from the bones, separating them into new, labeled dishes. Anywhere a stray fragment of foreign matter might have lodged, and then I found it again. It was smooth, ovoid, and utterly out of place. I recognized it immediately, not from botany textbooks but from memory. It was from a species of ornamental shrub, common in suburban gardens, particularly in areas with well-maintained landscaping. It was not, under any circumstance, something that would naturally be found in this specific stretch of remote wilderness. If the body had spent its initial post-mortem period in a garden, or near one, the decomposition process could have been very different. Perhaps more rapid, due to warmer temperatures and richer soil microbes, leading me to overestimate the time since death if I was only considering wilderness exposure. Or, conversely, if it was buried, the process could have been slowed, making the bones appear younger than they truly were. The implications were enormous. It meant the killer had gone to extraordinary lengths to stage the scene. They hadn't just dumped a body. They had attempted to mislead any potential investigator by placing it in an environment designed to suggest a different narrative. The choice of this remote location wasn't just about isolation. It was about misdirection. The killer was cunning. They understood the basic principles of decomposition, or at least enough to attempt to manipulate the scene. They were trying to hide not just a death, but a life and a location. My gaze swept over the sterile tools, the precise measurements, the carefully cataloged samples. This wasn't a quick, panicked disposal. This was a performance, carefully orchestrated. And I was now standing backstage, pulling back the curtain on the killer's grim theater. My initial confidence in a straightforward analysis evaporated, replaced by the unsettling certainty that I was dealing with someone far more dangerous and intelligent than I had first assumed. The air inside the mobile forensic unit at a remote location was a controlled chill, a stark contrast to the biting wind that still occasionally rattled the unit's aluminum shell outside. I stood over the remains, the articulated bones spread across the examination table like a macabre jigsaw puzzle, each piece now screaming a new, unsettling truth. This wasn't a simple case of exposure, I'd concluded. This was planning. This was effort. The natural death hypothesis, already wobbly, had collapsed entirely. My fingers, encased in nitrile, traced the curvature of a femur. The previous assessment, the one that had focused on the environmental degradation and initial trauma, suddenly felt insufficient. Like looking at a blurry photograph and only seeing the background, missing the sharp figure in the foreground. I'd been so fixated on where the body ended up, I hadn't fully explored why or how it got there in the first place, beyond the staging. Now, with the weight of that realization pressing down, I knew I had to go back to the beginning, to the bones themselves, with fresh eyes and a far darker premise. The quiet hum of the unit's generator was the only sound, a steady drone that accompanied my thoughts. The detective, back at the main camp, was probably expecting an update soon. He'd want answers, quick ones, but I wasn't in the business of quick answers. I was in the business of correct answers. And the correct answer, I suspected, was buried deep within these bleached fragments. My gaze swept across the skull first. No obvious perimortem trauma that hadn't already been noted, no blunt force, no sharp force that pierced bone. The cranium was largely intact, save for some post-mortem fracturing consistent with environmental stress. I moved down to the vertebral column, each segment carefully placed. The ribs, many fractured post-mortem, told a story of fragility after death, not violence before it, or so I'd initially thought. I picked up a magnifying loupe, the kind jewelers use, and brought it close to a section of the upper thoracic spine, vertebrae T1 through T3. I'd noted some erosion here, typical of scavenger activity or prolonged exposure, but nothing more. My initial focus had been on differentiating natural breaks from potential weapon impact, but now I wasn't just looking for blunt force. I was looking for anything out of place, anything that defied the narrative of a staged natural death. My eyes narrowed. There on the superior articular process of the second thoracic vertebra, T2, a tiny, almost imperceptible notch. It wasn't a clean break, nor was it the jagged edge of a post-mortem fracture. It was a linear defect, barely a millimeter deep but distinct. It had a slightly depressed center, almost like a miniature, elongated crater. I ran a gloved fingertip over it, feeling its minute texture. It felt deliberate. I leaned back, pulling a reference book from the shelf, a detailed atlas of osteological trauma. I flipped through pages, cross-referencing, comparing the minute feature on T2 to diagrams of various perimortem injuries. I dismissed stress fractures, micro-trauma from falls, even scavenging marks. This wasn't any of those. The edges were too sharp, too defined for environmental erosion. And the depression, the subtle concavity, didn't fit with post-mortem cracking. I remembered a case from years ago, a hunter who'd been mistaken for game. A ricocheted bullet, almost spent, had left a similar subtle mark on a scapula, a mere divot that looked like a chip until under magnification. But this wasn't a bullet. The shape was wrong. It wasn't circular, nor was it consistent with a sharp blade's deep cut. This was something else. I picked up the T2 vertebra, holding it delicately. The notch was on the posterior aspect, facing towards the back. It would have been incredibly difficult to inflict this wound without some precise, directed force. And it was so small, so unassuming, it could easily be overlooked, dismissed as a natural anomaly or a minor post-mortem chip. I'd almost done exactly that myself during the preliminary survey. The sheer audacity of it, to inflict such a subtle, devastating injury, and then try to hide it among the wilderness's natural decay. My mind raced, piecing together the implications. A wound this precise, this small, yet impacting a vital structure like the spine, could have been incapacitating, even fatal, without leaving a massive, obvious injury site. It would explain the lack of other major trauma, the initial confusion. If this was a perimortem injury, meaning it occurred around the time of death, then the victim wasn't just moved after dying naturally. The victim was killed. I placed the vertebra back on the table, my gaze lingering on that tiny damning mark. The quiet hum of the generator now seemed to throb with a new, sinister rhythm. This wasn't just a staged scene. It was a meticulously crafted lie designed to make a killing look like a natural end. A homicide. It changed everything. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and they had almost succeeded. Almost. I pulled out my camera, the macro lens already attached. Click. Each flash illuminated the tiny wound, capturing its exact dimensions, its telling characteristics. I knew I'd need to send this off for micro-CT scanning to confirm the depth and internal bone response, but I was already convinced. The pattern, the location, the complete absence of any repair or remodeling, it all pointed to a perimortem event. The detective's call would be coming soon. When it did, I wouldn't be reporting on a possible exposure or a curious case of body relocation. I'd be telling him we had a murder on our hands. And suddenly, the remote wilderness didn't feel quite so isolated anymore. It felt like a stage, and I was standing right in the middle of a very dangerous performance. I stood over the remains, the articulated bones spread across the examination table like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth, cool feel of bone, traced the faint lines of an old fracture on a tibia, then moved to the subtle, almost invisible pitting on the anterior surface of a cervical vertebra. It was all there, laid bare. Every minute detail I'd painstakingly observed over the past few days coalesced into a narrative far more sinister than a simple stumble and fall. "Anything new, William?" The detective's voice cut through the quiet hum of the ventilation system. He stood by the doorway, a mug of steaming coffee clutched in his large hands, the steam momentarily clouding his face. His expression was a familiar mix of exhaustion and expectation. He knew me well enough to understand that my silence usually meant I was either still chewing on a problem or about to drop a bombshell. I straightened, adjusting the magnification lamp. "The story these bones are telling isn't one of accidental death, detective. Not even close." He raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip. "Go on." The placement of the body, the scattered items. It was all too neat, too cliché for a genuine accident, but the real evidence is here. I gestured to the table. The microfractures around the distal end of the radius on the left arm, not from a fall, not consistent with impact against a rock. These are perimortem, fresh and indicative of a defensive injury, a struggle trying to ward off a blow. I pointed to a specific area on the occipital bone. And this, a small, depressed fracture, not blunt force trauma from a fall onto an uneven surface. This is focused, precise. It suggests a single, deliberate impact from a specific object. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Someone wanted this individual dead, and they went to considerable lengths to make it look otherwise. The detective set his mug down with a soft clink. So, a staged scene, and a killer who knew enough to try and cover their tracks. He rubbed his chin, his gaze sweeping over the bones. "Any idea on the weapon?" "Something relatively small, dense, and with a rounded but not entirely smooth surface. Hard to say without a more complete picture, but it wasn't a rock picked up at random. This was chosen." I felt a familiar prickle of frustration. The wilderness had done its job of stripping away the softer clues, leaving me with only the stark truth of the skeleton. The decomposition, the insect activity, the weathering, all consistent with the time frame we estimated. No surprises there, but it tells me the body was left where it was found relatively quickly after death. No secondary placement after further decomposition. So, they kill him, dump him, then try to make it look like he just keeled over. He mused, leaning against the door frame. Sounds like someone didn't want him found, or at least not found that way. Exactly, the deliberate disarray of his personal effects, the way they were scattered to imply a struggle against the elements. It was a narrative, a fabricated one, but they missed the subtle language of the bones. I picked up a small, almost imperceptible fragment of what I suspected was a foreign material embedded in a vertebral body. And this, I'm sending it to the lab for analysis. It's not bone, not rock, and it's not natural to the environment. The detective nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "All right, William, that's enough to light a fire under this. We'll expand the search, re-examine the immediate vicinity, and most importantly, we need to put a name to this individual. Any more specifics on the victim?" "Male, likely mid-40s to early 50s based on dental wear and degenerative changes. Good bone density, suggesting a reasonably active life. No major indicators of chronic illness, though I'm still running trace element analysis on bone samples. Height estimation puts him around 5 feet 10 inches. Caucasian, most probable given cranial features. And I picked up the mandible, pointing to a specific tooth. He had extensive, rather expensive dental work. A crown on the upper right molar, distinct and well done. That might be our best bet for identification." With my findings, the investigation shifted gears. The air of passive observation that had settled over the remote site evaporated, replaced by a focused, almost frantic energy. Forensic technicians, guided by my detailed notes, meticulously scoured the area again, this time with the knowledge that they were looking for a murder weapon and any other overlooked trace evidence. Meanwhile, the detective returned to his communication hub, armed with the physical description and the unique dental marker. The weight was agonizing. I returned to the bones, re-examining, double-checking, my mind racing through possibilities. What kind of person inspires such a carefully orchestrated demise? What secrets could be so volatile that they warranted a wilderness burial and a staged accident? I found myself running over the implications of the defensive wounds. He fought back. He wasn't caught entirely by surprise, or he put up a struggle before being overwhelmed. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the distant tree line, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the detective reappeared, a thick file clutched in his hand. His face was grim, but there was also a flicker of something else, surprise, perhaps. "We got him, William, or rather, we got a match. Dental records came through, name's Arthur Finch." He slid a laminated photograph across my examination table. I picked it up. The man in the picture was in his late 40s, neatly dressed, with intelligent if somewhat wary eyes. He had a strong jawline and a faint scar above his left eyebrow. He looked nothing like the skeletal remains before me. I could see the ghost of his features in the underlying bone structure. Arthur Finch, I repeated, the name tasting unfamiliar on my tongue. What do we know about him? The detective leaned against the table, the file open in front of him. He was a financial consultant, lived a quiet life in the city, no criminal record, no history of violence. Married 2 grown children, missing for just over 6 months. His family reported him missing after he didn't return from what they thought was a business trip. He paused, then pushed a few more documents my way. Here's where it gets interesting. His firm, Sterling Wealth Management, went under a few months after he disappeared. Massive fraud. Clients lost everything. Finch was the primary suspect. My breath hitched. A financial consultant. Fraud. This wasn't a backwoods brawl. This was something far more calculated. Someone wanted Arthur Finch gone. They wanted it to look like an accident, perhaps to let the financial scandal run its course without the complication of a murder investigation, to avoid suspicion falling on those he might have wronged. So, he wasn't just missing from a business trip. I mused, looking from the photo to the bones, then back again. He was dead, probably around the time he was reported missing, shortly after, and the killer wanted the world to think he just vanished, perhaps even fled with the money. That's the working theory now, the detective confirmed. He certainly had a lot of angry people looking for him. Investors, business partners, even his own family who claimed they knew nothing about the fraud. He tapped a finger on a line in the report. But here's the kicker. Arthur Finch wasn't just a suspect. He was found to have siphoned off millions. And according to the firm's other partners, he'd been planning an escape. Had a passport under an assumed name, purchased an offshore account. This put a whole new spin on the case. It wasn't just a murder. It was a murder wrapped in a disappearance, designed to look like a flight from justice. The killer had used the existing narrative of Finch's presumed escape to mask their own crime. A convenient narrative for the killer, I murmured, my gaze falling back to the small fragment I'd extracted from the vertebra. He was supposed to be gone, a ghost, but now he's here telling a very different story. A flicker of doubt, however, gnawed at me. The defensive wounds, the precise blow. Did a man planning to flee with millions, a man perhaps already on edge, really get caught unawares in the wilderness? Or was there something else? A meeting gone wrong? A betrayal by someone he trusted, someone who knew his plans? The more I learned about Arthur Finch, the less simple his death became. The carefully constructed scene in the wilderness, the elaborate cover-up, it wasn't just to hide a body. It was to solidify a lie that had already been put into motion. And that made the killer far more cunning, far more dangerous than I had initially given them credit for. The wilderness was just the canvas. The real artistry was in the deceit. The hum of the generator was a constant, low thrum against the metallic shell of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. Inside, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the persistent late summer heat, but at least it kept the gnats at bay. I leaned over a digital reconstruction of the skull, the bone fragments meticulously pieced together on the screen before me. My earlier findings, the precise blow, the subtle defensive wounds, still looped in my mind. a discordant melody against the initial assumption of a natural death. "Any breakthroughs, William?" The detective's voice, rough as gravel, cut through my concentration. He filled the doorway, a steaming mug cradled in his large hands. The scent of bitter coffee briefly overpowered the antiseptic and faint decay that clung to everything in my workspace. I straightened, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "Breakthroughs are for fiction. We have observations, and those observations are starting to look less like an accident and more like a very deliberate act." I gestured to the screen. "I've cross-referenced the impact trauma with known weapon profiles, the angle, the energy transfer. It's consistent with a blunt instrument, yes, but one wielded with significant force and precisely, not a random fall onto a rock." The detective nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "We've been digging into our victim's past. Robert Sterling, or what we thought was Robert Sterling. Turns out that identity was borrowed, or rather purchased." My eyebrows shot up. Purchased, so not even his real name. That explained a lot of the initial difficulty in identifying him. The lack of dental records, the generic descriptions from the few people who'd ever encountered him. "Exactly," the detective continued, stepping further into the unit, his gaze sweeping over my tools and diagrams. "The name belonged to a man who died in a fire years ago out of state, unrelated. Our victim, it seems, was quite adept at disappearing. But the paper trail, however faint, always leaves something." "And what did it leave?" I prompted, a flicker of genuine interest sparking through my professional detachment. "It left a name, Arthur Finch, and a rather messy history of failed business ventures. Specifically, one rather spectacular collapse involving a land development scheme that left a lot of people out of pocket, millions by some accounts." The detective's tone was flat, but I could hear the implications. Millions. That was a motive the wilderness couldn't provide. "Millions," I repeated, picturing the worn boots, the expensive but practical outdoor gear. The man was dressed for a long journey, but not one of poverty. And who was left most out of pocket? A collection of investors, sure, but one in particular stands out. A man named Silas Thorne. He lost everything. His family home, his retirement, his son's college fund, and he made it very public that he wanted Finch's head on a pike. A cold thread tightened in my gut. Silas Thorne. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken animosity. "Public threats are one thing," I said, trying to maintain my composure. But to follow through years later in the middle of nowhere. Thorne was known for being relentless. The detective clarified. "He went bankrupt, lost his wife, everything. He vanished from his old life too for a while. Re-emerged a few years back, working odd jobs, but never stopped obsessing over Finch. We have reports from his old colleagues, even a few former friends, saying Thorne swore he'd find Finch and make him pay. He believed Finch had hidden away a fortune, just enough to live comfortably while everyone else suffered." My mind raced, connecting the dots. The defensive wounds on Finch's forearms, consistent with an attempt to block an incoming strike. The precise, devastating blow to the head delivered from an angle that suggested a face-to-face confrontation, not an ambush from behind. And then the careful staging, the attempt to make it look like a tragic fall. "The staging," I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. "The body moved, arranged. The missing personal effects. It speaks to someone wanting to cover their tracks to delay identification. Someone who knew Finch had a reason to be anonymous. Someone who knew he was Robert Sterling now." The detective finished, his eyes meeting mine, a shared understanding passing between us. "And who would know that, other than someone who'd been actively looking for him, tracking his movements, perhaps even making contact." I thought back to the position of the body, the way it had been laid out almost artfully against the fallen log. Not just a clumsy cover-up, but something more deliberate. A final, macabre statement, perhaps, or a meticulous effort to mislead. "The blow," I said, returning to the skull reconstruction. "It wasn't just powerful, it was efficient. Someone who knew how to deliver a killing strike, or at least someone driven by intense rage who got lucky." The defensive wounds suggest Finch wasn't entirely surprised, but he also wasn't prepared for the level of violence. A meeting gone wrong, the detective mused. Finch perhaps thought he was meeting an old associate or maybe even someone offering a new opportunity. A man like him always looking for the next score, even on the run. Or a man who was expecting a confrontation. I countered, a new thought emerging. But not one that would escalate to murder. He might have thought he could talk his way out of it or intimidate his way out. The defensive wounds aren't just blocking, they're almost a plea for a pause, a moment of recognition before the final impact. The detective rubbed his chin. So Thorne tracks him down, lures him here perhaps under some pretense or maybe just corners him. They argue. Thorne, driven by years of resentment, snaps, and then realizing what he's done tries to hide it. It fit too well almost. A prime suspect, a clear motive, a plausible scenario. But a part of me, the part that always looked for the subtle inconsistencies, still felt a tremor of unease. Did Silas Thorne, a man described as relentless but not necessarily cunning, possess the foresight and meticulousness to stage the scene so carefully? The missing wallet, the specific arrangement of the body, the choice of such a remote location. It spoke of planning beyond a spontaneous fit of rage. What about Thorne's current whereabouts? I asked, my voice betraying none of my internal reservations. That's the next step, the detective said, already turning towards the door. We're putting out feelers. He's a drifter mostly. Hard to pin down, but now we have a name, a face, and a very compelling reason to find him. And your analysis, William, just put a solid foundation under that suspicion. As the detective left, the hum of the generator seemed to grow louder, filling the sudden silence. The name echoed, a new focal point for my investigation. The hum of the generator was a constant, low thrum against the metal walls of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. It had been an irritating drone earlier, but now it felt like a counterpoint to the buzzing in my own skull. The detective's parting words, the name he'd offered as a potential identity for the remains, still echoed. Is it too easy? That question had taken root, a tiny, insistent weed in the well-tended garden of my forensic certainty. I pushed away the last of the half-eaten field rations. Sleep felt like a betrayal, a luxury I couldn't afford. Not with that whisper nagging at me. I needed to go back, not to the wilderness site itself, but to the data, the samples, the hundreds of high-resolution images captured before anything was disturbed. I needed to see if I'd missed something, if that too-easy feeling had any basis beyond my own jaded skepticism. The unit's single examination table was cluttered with trays of carefully labeled evidence. Soil samples in sterile containers, bags of leaf litter, fragments of bone. I started with the macroscopic, projecting the panorama shots of the discovery site onto the large screen. The skeletal remains lay nestled in a shallow depression, partially covered by decades of accumulated detritus. It had looked so utterly natural, so undisturbed. The way the roots of the small, hardy shrubs had grown over the tibia, the calcified roots clinging to the patella. It spoke of time, of slow decay, of nature reclaiming its own. My gaze drifted, zooming in on the immediate vicinity of the skull. The soil here was a rich, dark loam, characteristic of this specific pocket of the wilderness. I'd taken core samples from beneath the entire skeleton's footprint. The initial analysis had shown a consistent soil profile, nothing to suggest recent excavation or significant disturbance. But as I scrolled through the microscopic images of the soil cross-sections, a faint anomaly pricked at my concentration. Underneath the cervical vertebrae, where the skull had rested, there was a minute, almost imperceptible compression. It wasn't the natural compaction of millennia. It was different. A subtle layering like a thin, almost invisible film of finely crushed plant matter pressed down. I'd noted it, dismissed it as random organic debris. I pulled up the detailed photographs of the area immediately surrounding the skull, then the close-ups of the leaf litter. The topmost layer was a mosaic of fresh pine needles and broadleaf detritus, typical of the current season. Beneath that, older, more decomposed layers. all normal. But then I noticed something in one of the extreme close-ups, taken from directly under where the mandible had rested. A single, distinct leaf, a species I knew wasn't native to this particular microenvironment. It was a fragment, brittle and brown, but unmistakable. It was from a species of oak that grew about a mile east, near the old logging road, where the canopy was more open. My breath hitched. How could a single leaf from a distant oak settle so precisely under the mandible, beneath the current season's pine needles, yet above the truly ancient decomposed layers? It was like finding a single mismatched button sewn onto an otherwise perfectly mended garment. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the images again, this time with a new, unsettling lens. The roots. I'd focused on their tenacious grip, their testament to time. But what if that was exactly the point? I zoomed in on the shrub whose roots had entwined themselves so naturally around the tibia. The roots themselves looked established, yes, but the soil, immediately surrounding the bone, where the root had grown over it, showed a peculiar lack of the fine, feeder rootlets that would have permeated the soil if the bone had been there for the entire lifespan of the shrub. It was as if the bone had been placed there, and the root, already established, had simply continued its growth, encompassing the foreign object, rather than having grown around it from the very beginning. The growth wasn't integrated enough. My initial assessment, my certainty that the body had simply decomposed where it lay, began to crumble. This wasn't natural decay. This wasn't even a clumsy attempt to hide a body. This was something far more deliberate. I toggled to the images of the surrounding terrain, the wider shots that showed the slope and the water flow patterns. There had been no signs of erosion or shifting earth that would explain the precise placement of that single, foreign leaf, or the subtle soil compression. No animal activity that could have dragged a specific leaf and tucked it so neatly. This wasn't a body that had simply yielded to the wilderness. This was a scene carefully constructed, painstakingly arranged to tell a specific story. A story of natural death, of undisturbed repose, of time's slow hand. But it was a lie. The fragments of bone, the soil, the plant matter, they weren't just evidence of a death. They were props in a macabre play. The killer hadn't just disposed of a body, they had staged a scene. Every seemingly natural detail, from the way the bones lay scattered to the innocent-looking root tendrils, was a calculated deception. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was someone who understood forensic processes, someone who knew how to mimic nature's slow artistry. And they had almost fooled me. Almost. I pulled out the full skeletal inventory, re-examining the minute details of each bone. The small, almost imperceptible gnaw marks on one of the phalanges, initially attributed to rodents, now seemed too precise, too uniform. Had they been added to enhance the illusion of natural scavenging? The way the smaller bones were scattered, mimicking the work of scavengers, suddenly felt too perfect, almost artful. My mind raced, replaying every step of the initial examination. Had I been too quick to accept the narrative the scene presented? Had my own experience, my expectation of how such things should look, blinded me to the subtle discord? The answer, a bitter pill, was yes. I had seen what I expected to see. The implications were profound. If the scene was staged, then everything I thought I knew about the circumstances of death, the timeline, even the immediate cause, was suspect. The time of death might be entirely different. The location of death might be miles away. And the identity the detective had offered, the too easy lead, now felt like another potential layer of misdirection. This wasn't just a murder. It was a carefully crafted illusion. And the person behind it was not only cunning but meticulously patient. They had taken the time to arrange every detail, to wait for nature to begin its slow dance of camouflage. They weren't just trying to hide a crime, they were actively trying to mislead. I looked at the skeletal remains, now no longer a simple discovery but a silent testament to a hidden agenda. The quiet wilderness, once a passive backdrop, now felt like an accomplice, its natural processes hijacked for a sinister purpose. My initial certainty had fractured, replaced by a deep, unsettling understanding. This wasn't just about finding a killer. It was about unraveling a meticulously woven lie. And I had a feeling the truth was going to be far more dangerous than I had initially imagined. My work had just begun, again, with an entirely new set of rules. The detective's parting words, the name he'd offered as a potential killer, resonated like a struck bell. The park ranger. I repeated the role in my head, a slow burn of disbelief turning into a cold, hard knot of conviction. The park ranger. The man who'd been so helpful, so knowledgeable about the local flora and fauna, so keen to point out the natural hazards of the wilderness. The man who'd led us directly to the site, ostensibly to help, but now I saw his movements through a different lens. I walked back to the main examination table, my gaze sweeping over the various evidence containers. Bone fragments, soil samples, remnants of the victim's tattered clothing. It was all there, meticulously cataloged, but the true story had been hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by the very wilderness it was found in. I picked up the small bag containing what I'd initially dismissed as a naturally broken twig, found a few feet from the skull. Its fracture looked organic, jagged, like something snapped by an animal or a heavy boot. But something about it had nudged at the back of my mind. I placed it under the high magnification microscope, adjusting the focus with a familiar, almost automatic precision. The twig filled the viewport, its rough bark a miniature landscape of ridges and valleys. I rotated the sample slowly, my breath held, and then I saw it. Not a natural break, not entirely. Faint, almost imperceptible striations, too uniform for a random snap, ran along the splintered edge. They were fine, almost hair-thin. Like a blade had started the cut, then the wood had been snapped along the weakened line. A single, minuscule fleck of something alien was embedded in the bark near the fracture. It was dark, almost black and glistening faintly, catching the focused light. I zoomed in further, the image blurring for a moment before snapping into sharp clarity. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't tree sap. It was a fragment of something processed, something manufactured. A sealant. My mind flashed back to the detective's casual remark about the park ranger's hobby, a detail I'd tucked away as irrelevant background noise. He's quite the woodcarver, William. A special wax. I leaned closer to the microscope, my heart beginning to tap a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The fleck under the lens looked like compressed, hardened wax, a deep, rich brown, almost black with a subtle, earthy sheen. It wasn't just a wax. It matched the description perfectly. The park ranger's signature. This wasn't just a natural death. The victim hadn't stumbled and fallen, breaking a twig on the way down. The park ranger had used a tool, likely a knife from his carving kit, to weaken the twig, then snapped it to make it look like a natural break. A small, almost insignificant detail, part of the elaborate staging designed to mislead. But it was enough. It was the thread that unraveled the whole deception. The park ranger knew the terrain intimately. He knew where to find the specific kind of lichen that grew only on certain rocks, the type I'd found beneath the victim's remains, suggesting the body had been moved. He knew the seasonal patterns of the predators that would scavenge a body, accelerating decomposition and obscuring evidence. He'd used all of it. He'd orchestrated a perfect wilderness tableau of natural death. And I'd almost bought it, had I been so eager to find a killer that I was now fabricating connections. There was this just confirmation bias, seeing what I wanted to see. I pulled back from the microscope, rubbed my eyes. No, the striations were there, the wax was there. These weren't figments of my imagination. These were facts, and they pointed to one man. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the satellite phone. I needed to call the detective, relay this final, damning piece of evidence. The small screen glowed to life, displaying a single bar of signal, flimsy, but it was there. I punched in the number, waited, ringing once, twice. Then a click and a dead line, nothing, just the faint hiss of static. I tried again, same result. The signal was too weak, too intermittent. I was truly isolated out here, miles from any cell tower, dependent on this temperamental satellite connection. A sudden shudder ran through the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. Not a rumble from the generator, but a distinct thump against the side wall near the rear. My head snapped up, my gaze darting to the small, reinforced window. Nothing but the inky blackness of the wilderness outside, punctuated by the occasional glint of moonlight on distant snow. The generator, which had been a constant, reassuring presence, suddenly coughed. A deeper, rougher rumble. Then another cough. I fumbled for my tactical flashlight, my fingers scrambling over the cool metal of the examination table. The beam cut through the black, a narrow, shaky tunnel of light. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom to make sense of the new, unsettling sounds. A soft scrape like metal on metal came from the exterior of the unit near the generator housing. Then a deliberate clink. Someone was out there. Someone had tampered with the generator. A prickle of ice ran down my spine. He knew. The park ranger knew I was close. He'd been watching, waiting. My flashlight beam swept across the sturdy, locked door. It wouldn't hold against a determined assault for long. I was a forensic anthropologist, trained to reconstruct the past, not to defend myself in the present. My only weapon was my mind, and right now it was screaming one word: danger. A faint creak, barely audible above the ringing in my ears, came from the back of the unit. The emergency exit hatch, usually secured with heavy bolts. It sounded like someone was testing it, applying pressure. I gripped the heavy metal ruler I'd used for scale on crime scene photos, the only thing within reach that offered any semblance of defense. My knuckles were white. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was here, and he was coming for me. The hum of the generator was a constant, low thrum against the corrugated metal walls of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, and the faint, metallic tang of the samples I'd been processing for days. I was hunched over the microscope, my eye glued to the eyepiece. The world outside the vast, indifferent wilderness temporarily forgotten. It wasn't just a wax. It matched the description provided by the investigator regarding the personal effects recovered from the primary suspect's dwelling. My heart, which had been tapping a nervous rhythm against my ribs, now shifted into a more urgent tempo. I adjusted the focus, bringing the intricate surface into sharper relief. Under this magnification, I could see minute striations, almost like tiny wood grain patterns, embedded within the waxy matrix. It wasn't smooth, like candle wax. It had a gritty, almost organic texture, as if it had been blended with fine earth or pulverized bark. I nudged the slide ever so gently with a gloved finger, watching the fleck shift, revealing a slightly lighter underside, almost a deep ochre. This wasn't an accidental transfer from the environment. This was something specific. I carefully retracted the slide, placing it in a labeled Petri dish. My hands, usually steady as bedrock, had a tremor I couldn't quite suppress. I moved to the small workstation, pulling out the sealed evidence bag containing the personal effects the investigator had mentioned. It was a Ziploc-style bag, clear, with a neat label. Inside, among other items, was a leather sheath. Not just any leather sheath, but a hand-tooled one, dark, almost black, with intricate, swirling patterns pressed into the hide. It looked custom-made. I remembered the investigator's notes, a brief addendum to the initial report. Subject known to possess a custom hunting knife, often carries it in a unique, handcrafted leather sheath. Sheath routinely treated with a specialized protective wax for wilderness conditions. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, then carefully extracted the sheath. It was stiff, well-maintained, and smelled faintly of treated leather and something else. Something earthy and slightly sweet. I ran my thumb along the surface. There was a subtle tackiness, a residue that wasn't quite sticky but certainly present. I took a sterile micro spatula and scraped a minuscule amount from a less conspicuous area of the sheath, careful not to damage the tooling. I transferred the tiny sample to a clean slide, added a drop of solve in a specific blend I'd formulated for organic residues, and watched as the solid began to soften, then melt, releasing that same earthy, sweet aroma. Back to the microscope. The sheath sample, under the same magnification, showed the identical deep brown, almost black hue, the same subtle earthy sheen. But more critically, as the solvent evaporated and the wax recrystallized, those minute striations, those tiny patterns that looked like embedded bark or fine grit, reappeared. They were identical, a perfect match. My breath hitched. It wasn't just a match in color or texture. It was a match in composition, in the unique impurities, the specific blend that gave it that gritty, organic feel. This wasn't just a wax. This was the wax, the specialized protective wax used for this specific sheath, and a fleck of it was embedded in the skeletal remains of the victim. The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. The victim hadn't just died in the wilderness. They had struggled against someone who was carrying this very sheath. The wax, transferred during that violent interaction, was now an undeniable signature. It wasn't just a clue, it was a physical link, a direct connection between the primary suspect's personal effects and the victim's remains. William. I almost jumped, spinning around. It was the investigator standing in the doorway of the unit, a mug of steaming coffee in one hand, his face etched with fatigue. He just returned from another fruitless search of the surrounding area. "You find something?" he inquired, his voice low, cautious. I slowly turned back to the microscope, my mind racing. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The staged scene, the careful positioning of the body, the environmental clues meant to misdirect. All of it designed to obscure a violent act. And this wax, so small, so easily missed, was the killer's undoing. "I found it," I responded, my voice hoarse, barely a whisper. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "The missing link. This isn't just wax, investigator. This is a specific blend unique to a hand-tooled leather sheath. Your suspect's sheath." His eyes widened, the tiredness momentarily replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely," I affirmed, my voice gaining strength. "The micro-composition, the embedded particulate matter, the color, the sheen, it's all identical. This fleck was transferred to the victim during the struggle. It means the killer was there with that sheath when the victim died. It wasn't a natural death, investigator. It was a close-quarters, violent confrontation." He set his coffee mug down on a nearby counter with a soft thud. "So, the knife. You think it was the murder weapon?" I nodded slowly. "It's a strong possibility. A custom hunting knife known to be carried in this sheath. The type of injury needed to kill discreetly and then stage a scene. It fits. The killer likely handled the body extensively, perhaps even using the knife to create superficial injuries to mimic animal predation, or to sever something to facilitate the staging. This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was a direct accusation, undeniable and damning. And if I had found it, so could the killer, had they been more meticulous, but they weren't. They left a piece of themselves, literally, on the victim. The investigator ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed in thought. "This changes everything. We need to move, now." I nodded, already reaching for the camera to document the microscopic evidence, the proof. And the killer, wherever they were, would soon realize their carefully constructed facade was crumbling. I could almost feel their gaze, distant and predatory, already fixed upon us. The wilderness, which had once felt like a sanctuary for my work, now felt like an open, vulnerable space. The hum of the generator was a constant thrum against the metal walls of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location, a dull, rhythmic heartbeat in the otherwise profound stillness. My hands, steady despite the adrenaline still buzzing beneath my skin, maneuvered the camera, capturing the fractured edges of the bone, the almost imperceptible striations under magnification. This wasn't just proof. It was the final, devastating piece of a puzzle I'd spent weeks assembling. A sharp rap on the unit's door made me flinch, my focus momentarily shattered. I straightened, blinking against the glare of the microscope light. The door hissed open, revealing the detective, his silhouette framed against the fading twilight. His face, usually a mask of weary professionalism, was softened, a hint of something like relief in his eyes. "We got him, William," the detective said, his voice low, almost reverent. Just picked him up. Didn't even put up a fight. Said he knew it was only a matter of time. I felt a strange confluence of emotions, a wave of exhausted satisfaction, a prickle of lingering unease, and an odd, hollow pang. The danger, the abstract threat that had coiled in the back of my mind for days, had materialized and then, just as quickly, dissolved. It was over. The killer was no longer a phantom, a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, but a tangible, confined individual. Good. I managed, the word feeling inadequate, too small for the enormity of what had just transpired. I turned back to the microscope, the microscopic evidence still waiting for its final documentation. Tell me everything when I have a moment. For now, I need to finish this. The detective nodded, understanding. He knew the meticulous nature of my work, the necessity of every detail. He retreated, leaving me once more to the quiet hum and the silent testimony of the bones. I worked through the next hour, documenting every angle, every fracture, every speck of foreign material embedded in the ancient remains. Each click of the camera was a hammer blow, driving the nails of justice into place. Later, the unit's small, cramped briefing area felt even smaller with the presence of the detective and a senior investigator. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the unspoken weight of the case. My notes, meticulously compiled over weeks, lay spread across the folding table, a testament to the slow, painstaking process of forensic anthropology. It all began with the initial assessment, of course. I started, my voice clear, methodical, stripped of any personal inflection. This wasn't about me. It was about the victim. The body was found in a remote wilderness site, carefully positioned to suggest a natural death. The initial lack of obvious trauma, the decomposition consistent with exposure, it was all designed to mislead. I tapped a photograph of the skeletal remains, highlighting the position of the limbs. But the positioning itself was the first flag. Too neat, too intentional for a natural collapse. And then, the subtle indications of perimortem trauma on the skull, not a blunt force impact, but a specific, localized compression. Small, almost invisible to the naked eye, but definitively present under the microscope. I pushed forward images of the microscopic bone fractures, circled in red. This indicated a precise application of force, inconsistent with a fall or animal activity. The bone's elasticity at the time of injury, the absence of healing, confirmed it was at or around the time of death. Then there was the deposition site itself. I continued, moving to another set of photos, the surrounding soil, the vegetation. The soil composition at the immediate burial site was inconsistent with the broader geological makeup of the area. We found trace elements that suggested the body had been moved, not far perhaps, enough to place it in a slightly different microenvironment. The senior investigator, a stern woman with sharp eyes, scribbled notes, and the environmental evidence. Crucial, I affirmed, picking up a small vial containing dried pollen and soil samples. The pollen analysis, thanks to the botanist's work, revealed a specific flora profile on the remains that did not match the immediate discovery site. Instead, it matched a very particular, localized cluster of plants found roughly 5 kilometers to the northeast, a small, isolated clearing near an old logging road. This suggested the initial event, the death, occurred there. I laid out the last set of images, the microscopic fibers I documented just hours ago. And finally, the microscopic fibers, embedded deep within the compressed skull fracture, almost invisible. They were synthetic, a polymer commonly found in a very specific type of outdoor gear. When cross-referenced with the victim's known belongings, we found no match. But when we looked at the suspect's known possessions, specifically a heavy-duty hiking boot, the fibers were a perfect match. The pressure from the boot, the precise point of impact, the type of fiber, it all aligned. I paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle. The victim was struck, likely from behind, with significant but localized force. The killer then transported the body a short distance, attempting to mimic a natural death by carefully arranging the remains. The intention was to let time and the elements erase the truth, to let nature claim responsibility for what was, in fact, a calculated act of violence. The detective leaned back, a long exhale escaping his lips. So the compression from the boot was the murder weapon. Effectively, yes, I confirmed. A blunt instrument, one disguised as footwear. The killer's own shoe applied with deadly intent. It was meticulously planned, meticulously executed, and almost perfectly concealed. But nature, in its own way, always leaves clues. And the bones, they always tell the truth if I know how to listen. A profound silence descended, heavier than the generator's drone. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding, of justice finally finding its voice. I had doubted myself, questioned my initial instincts, but the bones had never wavered. They had held their secrets patiently, waiting for me to coax them out, piece by agonizing piece. The tension hadn't fully left my shoulders, but it had shifted, transforming from a premonition of danger to the quiet, resolute burden of having borne witness. The generator's low hum, a constant companion for weeks, felt different now. No longer a white noise backdrop to frantic discovery, it was a steady, rhythmic sigh in the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. The profound silence I'd sensed earlier had deepened, settling into the very marrow of the earth. I stood by the folding table, running a thumb over the polished surface of a skull replica, not the actual bones. Those were already meticulously packed. The replica felt cold, smooth, and utterly resolved. They have him. The voice belonged to the lead investigator, a woman whose patience I'd tested more than once. She leaned against the doorway, her silhouette framed by the last sliver of twilight bleeding through the unit's rear hatch. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I didn't turn immediately. Details. I questioned my own voice a little rougher than I expected. The adrenaline had finally receded, leaving behind a dull ache in my shoulders and a quiet exhaustion that resonated deep in my bones. Confessed, almost immediately, once confronted with my findings. She paused, then added, the specific marks I identified, the ones we initially dismissed as animal gnawing. A small, grim satisfaction bloomed in my chest. They weren't gnawing, they were attempts to obscure, to mimic. I turned then, meeting her gaze. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of professional stoicism and something akin to respect. The pattern, the depth, the angles not consistent with any local fauna, and the environmental staging, the scattered debris, the displaced soil layers. It was all too perfect, too deliberate. He claimed it was an accident at first, she continued, pushing off the door frame. A fall, a head injury. But the evidence I presented, William, it picked apart every lie. The small fracture near the mastoid process, that wasn't from a fall. That was a targeted blow. And the subsequent efforts to move the remains, to position them, to make it look like nature had done the rest. I nodded slowly, remembering the weeks of meticulous work. The initial doubt had been a heavy cloak, wrapping itself around my instincts. The wilderness, with its vast indifference, was an excellent accomplice for a killer. So many variables, so much natural decay and disruption. It always came down to something depressingly mundane. Inheritance, the investigator confirmed, her tone flat. A significant sum. The victim was a distant relative thought to be lost but resurfaced. The killer saw an opportunity to remove a claimant to a fortune he believed was rightfully his. She shook her head. Long-held resentment coupled with greed. A classic. Classic, yes, but the execution had been anything but. The cleverness, the audacity, the patience required to stage such a scene. It was almost admirable in its depravity, and it had nearly worked. If not for the faint, almost imperceptible striations on a single vertebra, if not for the slightly out-of-place lichen growth on a fragment of skull, if not for the subtle variations in the soil compaction beneath where the body had rested versus the surrounding ground. Tiny, insignificant details to the untrained eye, but screaming anomalies to mine. The danger had been palpable, a silent predator in the very air I breathed out here. That tension hadn't fully dissipated even now. It lingered, a phantom echo of how close I'd come to something far worse than a misdiagnosis. "So it's over," I added, the words feeling heavy, final. "For us, yes," she replied. "The unit will be dismantled by morning. We'll have a formal report to file, but the core of it, the truth of what happened, that's thanks to William." His acknowledgement was simple, unadorned, but it resonated. For so long, my work had felt like an endless cycle of deciphering the dead, a grim procession of forgotten lives. I'd grown jaded, seen too much cruelty, too much indifference. The beauty of the bones themselves, their elegant structure, had been overshadowed by the brutal stories they told. I had begun to question the point, the efficacy of it all. What difference did it truly make? But standing there, the hum of the generator, a comforting thrum, the crisp air clearing my head, I felt it. A renewed purpose. It wasn't about the grand pronouncements or the headlines. It was about this. It was about the meticulous, often tedious work that allowed justice to find its way, even in the most remote, forgotten corners of the world. The image of the victim, not as a skeleton, but as a person, briefly flashed in my mind. Someone with a past, a future stolen, hopes dashed. I had spent weeks with their remains, trying to understand their final moments, trying to hear their silent plea. And now they had been heard. I took a deep breath, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. "Good," I answered, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in days. "Then I suppose there's packing to do." The lead investigator returned a small, knowing smile. "Always packing, William. Always moving on to the next." As I began to carefully stow away my instruments, the calipers, the magnifiers, the small brushes that had coaxed secrets from dust, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The mobile forensic unit at a remote location would soon be gone, leaving only the memory of its presence and the quiet triumph of a truth unearthed. This wasn't an ending, not really. It was a beginning, sharper, clearer, and far less jaded than I'd ever thought possible.